What if the loudest scandal in the world didn't start with proof, but with a pause? Not a scream, not a denial, not even a carefully worded statement. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes people lean forward. The kind that invites speculation. The kind that, in the age of screens and scrolls, becomes a weapon all on its own. Because overnight, a claim exploded across the internet. Screenshots, threads, anonymous posts, dramatic thumbnails, whispered voiceovers, all repeating the same three words in different forms. It's over. And attached to that phrase was something even more explosive. A rumor, an allegation, a story so extreme that it felt impossible, yet impossible to ignore. A palace document, DNA, and two children at the center of a global firestorm. Before we go any further, let's be clear about one thing. What you're about to hear is not a declaration of fact. It's a breakdown of how a story like this forms, why it spreads, and why millions of people are talking about it right now. This is about allegations, speculation, and the machinery of modern scandal. Because whether a claim is true or false, once it escapes into the wild, it takes on a life of its own. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And that life can be destructive. So let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed that the biggest controversies don't begin with evidence? They begin with doubt. This one started quietly. No press conference. No front-page headline. Just a handful of posts circulating in corners of the internet most people never visit. At first, it sounded absurd. The kind of rumor that burns bright for a day and then disappears. But it didn't disappear. It multiplied. Within hours, content creators were asking loaded questions instead of making claims. Why won't the palace respond? Why now? What are they hiding? Those questions spread faster than any answer ever could. Because questions don't need proof. They just need curiosity. And curiosity is powerful. Especially when the subject is royalty. Especially when the story involves children. Especially when it touches on identity, legitimacy, and bloodlines. Themes that have haunted royal families for centuries. The allegation was framed as shocking but vague. Supposedly, a piece of DNA-related documentation had been released, leaked, or confirmed, depending on which version you heard. Some said it came from palace insiders. Others claimed it was buried for years. A few even insisted it had always existed, hidden in plain sight. But here's the thing. No one could agree on what the document actually showed. Some versions said it proved something definitive. Others claimed it only raised questions. A few walked it back entirely, calling it a misinterpretation of unrelated paperwork. And yet, the story kept growing. Why? Because it landed at the perfect moment. Public trust is fragile. Institutions are questioned daily. People no longer assume authority equals truth. In fact, many assume the opposite. Silence isn't seen as dignity anymore. It's seen as confirmation. And when you mix that mindset with celebrity, royalty, and the internet's appetite for shock, you get a perfect storm. Think about how fast narratives move now. A single claim can circle the globe before breakfast. By the time anyone issues a response, the audience has already chosen sides. And in this case, the sides weren't just about two adults. They were about children who never asked to be symbols. Archie and Lilibet have always occupied a strange space in public consciousness. Simultaneously private and public. Seen and unseen. Spoken about constantly, yet rarely heard from directly. Their absence from view has been framed as protection by some, and secrecy by others. And secrecy, whether real or perceived, fuels imagination. People began connecting dots that may not exist. Dates, photos, facial features, timelines. Even medical terminology was dragged into conversations by people with no expertise, no verification, and no hesitation. It became less about evidence and more about belief. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you saw a rumor die because it lacked proof? Exactly. The louder the denial, the more suspicious it sounds. The quieter the response, the more people assume guilt. There is no winning move in the court of online opinion. And the palace, an institution built on controlled messaging, suddenly found itself facing a chaos it couldn't choreograph. Or so it seemed. Because here's where the story gets even more unsettling. There was no official denial. No confirmation. No legal threat splashed across headlines. Just nothing. and that nothing became the loudest sound of all. Commentators began dissecting past interviews. Old statements were replayed with new emphasis. Innocent phrases were reinterpreted as clues. Even moments meant to humanize became evidence in the eyes of skeptics. This is how narrative traps work. Once a theory forms, everything feeds it. If someone smiles, it's suspicious. If they don't smile, it's even worse. If they speak, they're controlling the story. If they stay silent, they're hiding something. There is no neutral ground. And then came the most dangerous turn. The idea of true parents. Let's pause here, because this is where responsible conversation matters most. Claims about children's origins are among the most harmful rumors imaginable. They strike at identity itself. They don't just question adults, they rewrite lives. And yet, these are the claims that gain the most traction, precisely because they feel forbidden. People aren't drawn to them because they're likely. They're drawn to them because they're shocking. And shock travels faster than truth. What makes this even more disturbing is how quickly speculation becomes certainty in online spaces. A creator says, "I'm just asking questions." Another repeats it as sources suggest. A third titles a video as if it's confirmed. By the time it reaches 1 million viewers, the word alleged has vanished entirely. Now let me ask you another question. Who benefits from that? Is it the public? Is it the children? Or is it the content machine that feeds on outrage and uncertainty? Because here's the irony. The more people claim to want the truth, the less patience they have for it. Truth is slow. Truth is boring. Truth doesn't fit neatly into a 60-second clip. But scandal? Scandal is instant. And that's why this story didn't slow down when doubts appeared. It sped up. Every lack of confirmation was treated as validation. Every attempt at nuance was drowned out by certainty. Yet beneath all of this noise is something deeply human. Fear. Fear that powerful institutions lie. Fear that narratives are manufactured. Fear that what we're shown isn't real. Those fears don't come from nowhere. They're built over years. And when they find a story that seems to confirm them, logic takes a back seat. This isn't just about one family. It's about trust itself. And that's why this matters now. Not because a rumor exists. Rumors always exist. But because of how eagerly they're consumed. Because of how quickly people choose belief over caution. And because once children are placed at the center of a public conspiracy, there is no undo button. Even if every claim is disproven tomorrow, the shadow remains. Names get attached to Google searches. Questions linger in comment sections. And a childhood becomes something to defend instead of something to live. So where does that leave us? At the edge of a story that feels too big, too emotional, and too explosive to be resolved cleanly. Because the truth, whatever it is, may not even matter anymore. What matters is perception. And perception is already set on fire. In the next section, we're going to trace exactly how this whisper began. Not the viral moment you saw on your feed, but the earlier sparks. The obscure corners. The first time someone dared to suggest what others only thought. Because once you see where it started, you'll understand why stopping it may be impossible. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most dangerous stories aren't the ones shouted from rooftops, but the ones murmured in corners? Because that's how this began. Not with a headline. Not with a broadcast interruption. Not with an official leak stamped and signed. It began with a whisper. A post buried deep in a forum most people never visit. No profile photo. No verified badge. Just a username that looked like it had been generated by accident. The kind of account that disappears as quickly as it appears. The kind you'd normally scroll past without a second thought. Except this time, people didn't scroll. The post was short, almost careless in tone. No dramatic language. No bold claims. Just a suggestion. A nudge. A sentence that read more like a question than an accusation. Has anyone ever wondered why certain records were sealed so tightly? That was it. No names. No children mentioned. No palace. Just curiosity. And curiosity is contagious. Within minutes, someone replied. Then another. Then another. Each comment adding a layer. A memory. A rumor they'd heard years ago but never took seriously. Old articles resurfaced. Screenshots of headlines from different years were placed side by side. Innocent discrepancies were framed as patterns. This is how whispers grow teeth. Someone dropped a vague reference to medical confidentiality. Another mentioned documents that never followed protocol. None of it was verified. None of it needed to be. The goal wasn't to prove anything. The goal was to suggest. And suggestion is powerful. Have you noticed how the human brain works? If you're told something directly, you resist it. But if you're guided to a conclusion yourself, you defend it as your own idea. That's exactly what happened here. No one said, "This is the truth." They said, "Isn't it strange?" And suddenly, strange became suspicious. The thread jumped platforms. A screenshot posted on social media with a caption that read, "Probably nothing, but interesting." That's all it takes. Once something is framed as interesting, people feel safe engaging with it. They don't feel reckless. They feel observant. From there, the story mutated. A content creator made a video reacting to the screenshot. They laughed at first, rolled their eyes, said it sounded ridiculous. But then they paused, replayed the line, looked thoughtful, asked their audience, "What do you think?" And the comments exploded. Some dismissed it outright. Others shared similar rumors they'd heard from friends, relatives, or obscure articles years ago. A few claimed insider knowledge without offering proof. And that's when the algorithm stepped in. Because controversy doesn't need confirmation to trend. It just needs engagement. The video was shared, then clipped, then reposted with a more dramatic caption. The original hesitation vanished. What started as a question became a suggestion. What was once framed as curiosity became framed as revelation. And still, no one official said a word. This silence didn't stop the whisper. It fed it. People began asking why certain stories had been shut down in the past. Why legal language had been so carefully chosen. Why some interviews avoided specifics while others emphasized emotion over detail. Were those choices strategic or defensive? Now pause for a moment and ask yourself something honestly. If you already distrust institutions, what does silence sound like to you? Exactly. It sounds like confirmation. At this point, the whisper had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer niche. It was no longer confined to conspiracy spaces. It was creeping into mainstream commentary disguised as analysis. Not "this happened," but "why hasn't this been addressed?" That framing is dangerous because it flips the burden of proof. Suddenly, the responsibility isn't on the person making the claim. It's on the person denying it. And denial, in this case, never came. Instead, the whisper gained a narrative spine. Someone claimed the palace had always known. Another said the information was sealed for stability. A third suggested legal threats were ready but unused because of optics. Each claim contradicted the last, yet somehow they all coexisted. How is that possible? Because people weren't following logic. They were following feeling. And the feeling was that something had been hidden. This is where history entered the chat. Commentators began reaching back decades, even centuries, pointing to past royal controversies involving legitimacy, heirs, and secrecy. They didn't need direct parallels. They just needed precedent. Once people believe something has happened before, they assume it can happen again. The whisper was no longer about one rumor. It was about a pattern. And patterns, even imagined ones, feel convincing. Then came the screenshots of supposed documents. Blurred, cropped, unverifiable. Some were quickly debunked. Others couldn't be traced at all. But it didn't matter. The existence of fakes didn't discredit the narrative, it reinforced it. Because skeptics were accused of being part of the cover-up. Do you see the trap now? If you believe the story, you're awake. If you question it, you're controlled. There is no neutral position. And that's when the whisper stopped being harmless. Because the focus shifted. No longer on systems. No longer on institutions. But on children. That shift didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually. Subtly. Almost politely. People said they were concerned. That they were just asking questions. That it was about transparency. But concern can be a mask. Suddenly, timelines about births were dissected. Medical privacy was reframed as secrecy. Normal inconsistencies were treated as smoking guns. Even the absence of photographs became suspicious instead of respectful. Ask yourself this. When did privacy become proof of wrongdoing? The whisper had become something else entirely. It had become a belief system. And belief systems don't require evidence. They require faith. What's even more unsettling is how quickly empathy disappears once a narrative takes hold. People who would never speculate about an ordinary child felt justified doing it here because the children were famous by association, because their parents were public figures. Because the institution involved was powerful, as if that makes it acceptable. But here's the contradiction no one wanted to confront. If the institution is powerful enough to hide something this massive, why would it suddenly allow it to leak? That question lingered, unanswered, drowned out by louder voices insisting they already knew the answer. And still silence. No statement. No clarification. No visible damage control. At least, none that the public could see. Which led to the most unsettling theory of all. What if the silence wasn't ignorance, but strategy? Some speculated that responding would legitimize the rumor. Others believed legal action would draw more attention. A few insisted that internal conflict prevented any response at all. Each theory contradicted the next. And yet, all of them pointed to the same conclusion. Something was wrong. Or at least, something felt wrong. And feeling, in the digital age, is often enough. By the time mainstream outlets began cautiously referencing the controversy, always with qualifiers, always with distance, the narrative was already set. The story had escaped the people who started it. It belonged to the audience now, and audiences don't like being told they're wrong, especially when they feel like they've uncovered something hidden. This is the moment when a whisper becomes a wildfire, because now, anyone who spoke against it wasn't just disagreeing. They were threatening an identity people had built around seeing through the lies. And once identity is involved, logic loses. So here we are, a story born from a question, nurtured by silence, amplified by distrust, and aimed, ultimately, at the most vulnerable figures in the entire saga. But the whisper still wasn't finished evolving. Because just when it seemed like the narrative had reached its most dangerous point, a new element appeared. Not a rumor, not a theory, but something people would call proof. And once that word entered the conversation, everything changed. Because what came next didn't just deepen the scandal. It gave it a shape. And that shape would dominate the conversation in ways no one was prepared for. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if DNA was never just science? What if, for centuries, it has been power disguised as biology? Because long before test tubes, labs, and modern genetics, bloodlines ruled everything. Not metaphorically, literally. Who you were allowed to be, what you were allowed to inherit, whether your name would be written into history or erased from it. And that's why this whisper didn't feel random. It landed on old ground. Royal ground. The moment the word DNA entered the conversation, something shifted. The rumor stopped sounding like internet noise and started sounding like history repeating itself. People leaned in not because they understood genetics, but because they understood power. Blood decides legitimacy. Legitimacy decides succession. Succession decides control. That equation has fueled wars, betrayals, imprisonments, and executions. Entire empires have risen and fallen on questions of parentage. So when modern audiences hear DNA attached to royalty, they don't hear a lab result. They hear a threat. And that's why the allegation hit with such force. Let's talk about why. For centuries, royal families have been obsessed with lineage. Not out of sentimentality, but necessity. Blood wasn't just symbolic. It was legal. It was political. It was the backbone of authority. If your bloodline was questioned, everything else collapsed with it. Titles could be stripped. Claims invalidated. Children delegitimized. Entire reigns rewritten as mistakes. History is full of examples where whispers about parentage destroyed lives. Sometimes those whispers were true. Often they weren't. But truth rarely mattered as much as belief. And belief, once it takes hold, is almost impossible to dislodge. So when modern audiences heard claims involving DNA and royal children, their minds didn't go to scientific protocols. They went to precedent, to scandals buried in dusty books and dramatized documentaries. Because deep down, people already believed one thing, that royal families keep secrets. Some of that belief is justified. Some of it is exaggerated. But perception doesn't operate on nuance. It operates on narrative. And the narrative says power hides things. That's why this allegation felt plausible to so many, even without proof. Now here's where the contradiction begins. In today's world, DNA testing is common, cheap, widely accessible. It's not mysterious anymore. Anyone can Some people assume that if DNA existed, it must be definitive. Others questioned why it would ever be made public. A few asked the most uncomfortable question of all. If DNA could settle everything, why hasn't it? That question spread fast. And it wasn't asked gently. It was asked with suspicion. But here's the reality no one wanted to confront. Royal legitimacy has never relied solely on biological truth. It relies on acknowledgement, recognition, acceptance by the institution itself. History shows us countless cases where children widely believed to be biologically connected were denied legitimacy, and others with questionable origins were embraced. Because power chooses truth when it suits it. That's not cynicism. That's history. So when people started framing DNA as the ultimate weapon, they misunderstood something crucial. DNA doesn't rule royalty. Narrative does. But try explaining that in an era addicted to receipts. The idea of DNA proof felt final, scientific, undeniable. And that illusion made the allegation more dangerous than any rumor before it. People stopped asking, "Is this real?" They started asking, "Why was this hidden?" And that's a very different question. Once the conversation shifts from existence to concealment, it becomes accusatory by default. Silence is interpreted as guilt. Complexity is dismissed as evasion. Now consider the position of an institution like the palace. If they deny, they draw attention. If they confirm, they validate speculation. If they explain, they invite further questions. There is no clean exit. And history has taught them one thing above all else. Never legitimize a rumor. But the internet doesn't work that way. People don't want absence. They want answers. And if answers aren't provided, they'll manufacture them. That's exactly what happened next. Content creators began framing DNA as inevitable, as something that must exist somewhere, locked away. They spoke as if it were common sense, as if secrecy itself was evidence. The word sealed became a centerpiece. Sealed records, sealed files, sealed agreements. That language carries weight. It suggests official action, deliberate concealment, intent. But here's another contradiction. If something is sealed, how does anyone know what's inside? They don't. They imagine it. And imagination fills gaps far more dramatically than facts ever could. This is where speculation turned theatrical. People began constructing narratives that felt logical because they followed familiar story arcs. Powerful institution, hidden truth, innocent children, eventual exposure. It's a script audiences recognize. And once a story fits a familiar script, people stop questioning its realism. But let's slow this down. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. If a royal institution were hiding something this explosive, would it really allow a leak so sloppy, so unverified, so easily debunked? Wouldn't it either clamp down completely or control the release? That question lingered, but it didn't gain traction. Why? Because doubt doesn't go viral. Certainty does. And the certainty being sold wasn't scientific. It was emotional. The idea that bloodlines still secretly decide everything. That children can be pawns. That power always protects itself. Those ideas resonate because they feel true, even when specific claims aren't. This is where fear enters. Fear that the world isn't fair. Fear that truth is selective. Fear that institutions don't play by the same rules as ordinary people. And fear doesn't need evidence. It needs validation. So the DNA narrative grew. People began talking less about what DNA is and more about what it represents. Control. If someone controls the narrative of origin, they control the future. And that's when the focus narrowed again. Back to two children. Children who didn't choose symbolism. Children who didn't ask to represent anything. Yet suddenly, their existence was being dissected as if it were a political document. This is the cruel irony. The more people claimed to be defending transparency, the less transparent their motives became. Was this really about truth? Or was it about the thrill of tearing down something untouchable? Because let's be honest, there is a satisfaction some people feel when powerful systems appear vulnerable. When myths crack. When icons fall. And that satisfaction can drown out empathy. Now here's the most important point of this chapter. Even if DNA could answer every biological question, it would not answer the social ones. It would not undo speculation. It would not erase damage. It would not protect children from narratives already written about them. And yet, people speak about DNA as if it's a reset button. It isn't. It's a spark. And sparks don't put out fires. They ignite them. Which brings us to the moment when this story crossed another line. Because soon, people weren't just talking about DNA as theory. They were talking about documents. Specific documents. Allegedly seen. Allegedly leaked. allegedly undeniable. And once documents enter the conversation, belief hardens. Because paper feels official, even when it isn't. And that's where this story takes its next turn. Because the moment people believed there was something tangible, something written, something real, everything escalated. But the document everyone claimed existed? It wasn't what it seemed. And what people missed about it would change how this entire story should be understood. But that realization didn't come immediately. Because what came next didn't bring clarity. It brought chaos. And once chaos entered the narrative, there was no controlling it. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when privacy stops being seen as protection and starts being treated like evidence? Because that was the moment this story truly crossed the line. Up until now, the conversation had hovered around institutions, systems, power, history, DNA as an abstract concept. Dangerous, yes, but still distant, still theoretical. Then the focus narrowed. And when it did, everything changed. The narrative stopped circling palaces and protocols and landed squarely on two children. Not by name at first, not directly. It began with phrases like the kids or the children involved. Soft language, almost respectful, as if avoiding names somehow made the speculation less invasive. But names always surface eventually. And once they did, the tone shifted. Archie and Lilibet had always existed in a strange duality. Famous, yet unseen. Talked about constantly, yet rarely photographed. Public by association, private by design. Their parents had made a deliberate choice early on to shield them from the relentless exposure that defined royal life. At the time, many applauded that decision. Others questioned it. And that question never really went away. It lingered quietly beneath the surface, resurfacing every time a photo wasn't released, every time a public appearance didn't happen, every time a milestone passed without documentation. At first, those questions were framed as curiosity. People just want to see them. It's natural to be interested, but curiosity can rot. And when this new rumor emerged, it found fertile ground in all that unresolved interest. Suddenly, privacy wasn't interpreted as a boundary. It was interpreted as concealment. Ask yourself honestly, how quickly did you see comments shift from "they deserve privacy" to "why are they hiding them"? That shift didn't happen because of evidence. It happened because of narrative convenience. Once a story needs a mystery, absence becomes suspicious. This is where speculation turned personal. People began scrutinizing timelines that had already been explained years ago. Birth announcements were reread with new emphasis. Language that once seemed formal was now described as evasive. Even the smallest deviations from tradition were treated as deliberate anomalies. Normal became questionable. Different became dangerous. And suddenly, ordinary parental decisions were being reinterpreted as strategic moves in a larger deception. Let's pause here. Because this is where empathy should step in, and often doesn't. Children do not control narratives. They inherit them. Every choice their parents make becomes something they'll one day have to answer for, whether it was right or wrong, public or private. Yet in this case, the children weren't just inheriting fame. They were inheriting suspicion. The language around them hardened quickly. People began saying things like, "the truth will come out eventually," and "children always find out." As if inevitability justified intrusion. As if destiny excused speculation. But what truth were they even talking about? No one could agree. One group insisted there was definitive proof hidden away. Another claimed inconsistencies proved deception. A third argued that even questioning it was cruel. These groups weren't debating facts. They were debating identity. And identity debates are rarely rational. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. On one hand, critics claimed the children were being exploited as symbols. On the other, they exploited them relentlessly in discussion. Every argument framed itself as concern. But concern doesn't require thumbnails. Concern doesn't need monetization. Concern doesn't ask strangers to choose sides. Yet this discourse did all of that. And it did it loudly. What made it worse was the way social media algorithms rewarded the most extreme interpretations. Calm voices were buried. Cautious language didn't trend. Emotional certainty did. So creators who hesitated were drowned out by those who didn't. Questions became statements. Statements became conclusions. And before long, The idea that the children's identities were somehow unresolved was treated not as a rumor, but as an open question the public was entitled to answer. Think about that for a moment. When did entitlement replace decency? Some justified it by saying royalty is public property. Others argued that by stepping away from royal life, the children were fair game for speculation. A few went further, claiming that secrecy itself invited investigation. That argument sounds logical until you apply it to any other child. Then it becomes grotesque. But logic wasn't driving this anymore. Momentum was. People began analyzing photos with absurd precision, lighting differences, angles, age comparisons, as if a childhood could be reverse-engineered through pixels. Experts suddenly appeared everywhere. Self-declared analysts, armchair professionals, individuals with no credentials confidently explaining why something didn't add up. And here's the unsettling part. Many of those explanations contradicted each other, yet they all reinforced the same conclusion. Something must be wrong. That's how conspiracy thinking works. It doesn't require consistency. It requires direction. As long as the arrow points toward suspicion, the path doesn't matter. And still, no response came. No correction. No clarification. Which fueled the most damaging belief of all, that the silence was protecting something. Now ask yourself this. If you were a parent watching this unfold, what would you do? Respond and amplify it? Stay silent and let it grow? Every option feels wrong. And that's the trap. Because public narratives about children create lose-lose scenarios for the adults around them. Any response becomes content. Any denial becomes dissected. Any emotional appeal is dismissed as manipulation. The children themselves, of course, have no voice in this. They are discussed, theorized about, and defined without consent. And that's what makes this chapter of the story so dark. The rumor no longer lives in abstract space. It lives in search results, in comment sections, in speculative videos that will outlast corrections. Even if the narrative collapses tomorrow, the digital residue remains. That's the part no one wants to talk about. Because it ruins the thrill. There's another contradiction worth confronting. Many people claim they care deeply about protecting children from media harm. They condemn paparazzi. They criticize exploitation. They demand boundaries. Yet those same voices participate in rumor cycles that are arguably more invasive than a photograph. Why? Because moral outrage feels different when it's framed as discovery. People convince themselves they're exposing wrongdoing, not causing harm. But harm doesn't care about intent. It cares about impact. And the impact here is a generation of discourse that treats children as evidence instead of individuals, as puzzles instead of people. This is where the story should have slowed down, where adults should have stepped back and said, enough. Instead, it accelerated. Because now, the children weren't just symbols. They were stakes. If the rumor was true, everything changed. If it was false, everything was still damaged. There was no outcome where this conversation ended cleanly. And that's when a new layer entered the narrative. One that gave people the illusion of certainty. The idea that something tangible existed. Not just theory, not just history, but paperwork, documents. Something people claimed could settle everything. And once that idea took hold, the conversation moved from emotional to forensic, from speculation to supposed evidence, from whispers to exhibits. And that transition is where the story takes its most dangerous turn yet. Because when people believe proof exists, they stop asking whether they should be looking for it. They only ask how to find it. And that hunger would soon be fed, but not in the way anyone expected. Because the document everyone began talking about, the one that supposedly held all the answers, would raise more questions than it resolved. And the way it surfaced would fracture the narrative in ways no one could control. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most convincing proof is the one no one can actually show? Because that's exactly what happened next. The whisper didn't just grow louder. It changed shape. Almost overnight, the language shifted. People stopped saying rumor. They stopped saying theory. A new word took over comment sections, captions, and video titles. Document. Not documents. Not paperwork. One document. Singular. Specific. Loaded. And according to the internet, everyone had seen it. Or at least knew someone who had. This is the moment where belief hardened into certainty. Because ideas can be debated. Stories can be questioned. But documents? Documents feel final. They feel official. They feel undeniable, even when they aren't. The first mentions were vague. Someone claimed there was a palace file circulating privately. Another insisted it was never meant for public eyes. A third said it had been shown to select insiders years ago and quietly buried. Notice the pattern? No one claimed to have it. They claimed proximity to it. I've seen screenshots. A friend of mine was shown it. A source confirmed its contents. Always one step removed. Always just out of reach. That distance is important because it creates safety. If you can't be asked to produce the document, you can't be challenged on it. You can describe it however you want. Shape it however suits your narrative. And that's exactly what happened. Different versions of the same alleged document began circulating, verbally. Some said it was a medical record. Others claimed it was legal paperwork. A few insisted it was correspondence between senior officials. Each version contradicted the others. Yet none of that slowed the story down. Because contradiction didn't weaken belief. It reinforced it. People began saying things like, "Of course there are different versions. They've tried to bury it." As if inconsistency itself proved authenticity. This is the paradox of conspiracy culture. The less clear something is, the more powerful it becomes. Then came the screenshots. Blurry, cropped, untraceable. Images of text with no headers. No letterheads. No signatures. No dates that could be verified. Just enough formatting to look official. Just enough ambiguity to avoid scrutiny. Some were debunked within hours. Others couldn't be verified either way. But debunking didn't kill the story. It fertilized it. Because now, believers had a ready-made defense. That one's fake. The real one hasn't surfaced yet. The real one always coming. Never arriving. Have you noticed how stories like this always promise revelation tomorrow? That's not an accident. Anticipation keeps people hooked. And creators leaned into it hard. Videos popped up dissecting the supposed document line by line, without ever showing it. Analysts spoke confidently about phrasing, implications, and legal meaning based on secondhand descriptions. Ask yourself, how can someone analyze a document they haven't seen? They can't, but they can perform analysis. And performance, online, often passes as expertise. The audience didn't care. In fact, many preferred not seeing it. Because seeing it would invite scrutiny. Not seeing it preserved mystery. Mystery feels more exciting than resolution. And then something else happened. The document stopped being described as evidence. It became a weapon. People began saying things like, "If this comes out, it's over. They'll never recover from this. This changes everything." But no one could explain why. What exactly did it prove? That answer shifted depending on who was talking. Some claimed it confirmed biological details. Others said it proved procedural violations. A few hinted at institutional wrongdoing so severe it would shake the monarchy. Big claims, no specifics, and still belief spread. This is where the psychology gets uncomfortable. People weren't chasing truth. They were chasing vindication. Many had already decided how they felt about the people involved. This document wasn't shaping opinion. It was justifying it. Confirmation bias took the wheel. Anything that aligned with existing beliefs was embraced. Anything that didn't was dismissed as propaganda. And the absence of an official response. That was folded neatly into the narrative. Of course they won't comment. Legal reasons. They're panicking. Silence became proof again. But here's the contradiction no one wanted to face. If a document truly existed that could devastate an institution built on reputation, why would it be allowed to float around in rumor form? Why wouldn't it be suppressed aggressively? Or controlled carefully? Why would it leak in fragments instead of exploding fully? Those questions were asked. They just weren't welcomed. Because they threatened the emotional payoff people were waiting for. And the payoff had been framed as inevitable. People spoke about exposure as if it were destiny. As if truth had a schedule. As if history owed them a reveal. That mindset is dangerous. Because it turns speculation into entitlement. We deserve to know. They can't hide forever. But who is we? And what gives we the right to demand answers about children? That question was drowned out. The document narrative had momentum now. And momentum doesn't care about ethics. It cares about escalation. Creators began hinting they'd seen parts of it off camera. Some claimed they couldn't show it for legal reasons. Others said they were protecting sources. That explanation sounds responsible, until you realize it's impossible to verify. It's the perfect shield. No proof required. No accountability demanded. Just trust me. That interpretation lasted about 12 hours. Then the tone shifted. The same silence that once looked composed began to look evasive. Headlines didn't say Palace declines to comment. They said Palace stays silent amid growing questions. Language matters. Decline suggests choice. Stays silent suggests avoidance. And avoidance invites suspicion. Have you noticed how quickly public mood flips when expectations aren't met? People don't stay neutral for long. They lean. And once they lean, they justify the direction. In this case, the lean was toward distrust. People began asking why the palace had responded swiftly to far smaller controversies in the past. Why legal teams had acted aggressively over minor issues. Yet here, with something allegedly existential, there was no visible pushback. Was that restraint or fear? That question became the heartbeat of the next phase. Speculation shifted from, what is the document? To what is the palace doing right now? Suddenly, every imagined meeting became content. Anonymous sources claimed emergency discussions were underway. Others said senior advisors were split on how to respond. Some insisted legal teams were preparing action but couldn't proceed without risking exposure. Each claim contradicted the last. But again, contradiction didn't kill the narrative. It energized it. Because chaos behind closed doors feels believable. Especially when the doors stay closed. People filled the silence with scenes from movies. Crisis rooms. Urgent phone calls. Advisors arguing. Decisions postponed. Reputations weighed against risk. None of it confirmed. All of it cinematic. And cinema is persuasive. Now here's the paradox most viewers didn't notice. If the palace truly feared the rumor, silence would be the worst option. But if the palace knew the rumor was baseless, silence would be the smartest. So which was it? That question split audiences in half. One side argued silence meant panic. That there was no good response because any response would expose something worse. That the institution was buying time. The other side argued silence meant confidence. That the story wasn't worth oxygen. That acknowledging it would legitimize something undeserving of response. Both arguments sounded reasonable. Both could not be true. And yet, both existed simultaneously. This is what makes silence so powerful and so dangerous. It becomes a mirror. People see what they already believe reflected back at them. Those predisposed to distrust saw evasion. Those inclined to defend saw discipline. And the palace, intentionally or not, allowed both interpretations to flourish. But here's the detail that tipped many skeptics over the edge. No legal threats surfaced. In a world where defamation lawsuits appear over tweets and headlines, the absence of visible legal action felt loud. Some argued this meant lawyers were quietly involved. Others claimed it meant lawyers advised against action because discovery could open doors better left closed. Again, speculation. But speculation framed as logic. And logic is dangerous when built on assumptions. Ask yourself this. If you were advising an institution whose power rests on stability, what would you do when faced with an unverified but viral allegation involving children? You'd hesitate, because every move risks amplifying harm. But hesitation looks like indecision from the outside. And indecision gets interpreted as weakness. This is where timing became critical. Every hour without response allowed the narrative to evolve. Each evolution made it harder to address. By the time a statement could have landed, it would have needed to address not one rumor, but a constellation of them. And that's when silence becomes self-reinforcing. The longer it lasts, the more people believe it's intentional. Some commentators began framing the silence as controlled containment, a deliberate choice to let the story burn itself out, to starve it of attention. That strategy has worked before, but it assumes one thing, that the audience will get bored. This time, they didn't, because the story had crossed an emotional threshold. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about children. And once children enter a narrative, interest doesn't fade easily. It intensifies. People felt morally justified in demanding answers. They framed their curiosity as protection, as concern, as advocacy. And the palace's silence, regardless of intent, felt incompatible with that framing. Why wouldn't an institution defend children from speculation? That question became a rallying cry. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Defending children publicly can sometimes expose them further. Any statement, no matter how careful, becomes content, becomes a quote. becomes something dissected and reframed. In trying to shut down a rumor, you can immortalize it. So silence may have been chosen as the lesser evil. But lesser evil doesn't feel satisfying to an audience demanding resolution. This tension reached its peak when commentators began comparing this silence to past moments of crisis. They said, "They spoke then, why not now?" But context matters. Past crises involved adults who chose public roles. This one involved minors who didn't. And yet, nuance rarely survives outrage. The silence was no longer interpreted as protective. It was interpreted as complicit. At this point, even people who didn't believe the rumor began questioning the strategy. Not because they thought the claim was true, but because they feared the cost of not responding. Reputation damage doesn't require truth. It requires repetition. And repetition was happening at scale. Now consider the internal pressure this would create. Not just public-facing pressure. Internal. Advisors watching the narrative spiral. Legal teams assessing risk. Communications experts debating tone. Every option flawed. Respond and legitimize. Ignore and appear guilty. Threaten legal action and escalate. Say nothing and watch speculation metastasize. There is no perfect move, which leads to the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the silence wasn't strategy or panic? What if it was paralysis? Institutions, like people, can freeze when stakes feel too high. Decision-making slows. Consensus fractures. Caution becomes default. And paralysis looks exactly like silence. This possibility doesn't imply guilt. It implies fear of making the wrong move. But the public doesn't distinguish between those. To the outside world, silence is a message. And the message being received was clear. Something about this story made the usual playbook unusable. And that realization alone fueled suspicion. Because people don't need proof of wrongdoing to believe something is off. They just need deviation from normal behavior. And this was a deviation. The longer the silence stretched, the more it took on meaning. People read intention into every non-action. Every day, without comment, felt deliberate. And deliberate silence feels calculated. Which brings us to the next pivot. As focus intensified on the palace's lack of response, attention began shifting elsewhere. If the institution wouldn't speak, maybe the individuals would. Eyes turned across the ocean, toward a place far from royal corridors, toward Montecito, toward the people who, according to the rumor, were at the center of it all. And the question changed again. Not, why is the palace silent? But why aren't they responding either? Because if silence at the palace looked strategic or suspicious, silence there looked personal, emotional, human. And that difference would reshape the narrative in ways no one anticipated. Because the next phase of this story wouldn't be about institutions at all. It would be about two people under siege. And the silence they kept would be interpreted very differently. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What happens when silence stops looking strategic and starts looking human? Because this is where the story took a turn no one fully anticipated. Up to this point, the narrative had been framed around institutions. Palaces, protocols, advisors, strategy, silence as a calculated move, weighed and approved in rooms far from public view. But then the spotlight shifted. And when it did, everything felt different. The cameras weren't pointed at gates or guards anymore. They were pointed at a home, a family space, a place that had been sold to the world as a retreat from all of this. Montecito. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. This was supposed to be the place where the noise stopped, where the rules of royal life no longer applied, where control over narrative was reclaimed. Instead, it became the center of the storm. And the question changed again. Not, why isn't the palace speaking? But why aren't they? At first, the silence from Montecito was interpreted with sympathy. People assumed shock, disbelief, a desire to protect children from chaos they didn't create. But sympathy online has a short half-life. Within days, that same silence began to feel heavy. Content creators speculated openly about emotional fallout. Were they blindsided? Were they furious? Were they consulting lawyers? Were they negotiating behind the scenes? No one knew, but everyone guessed. And guessing, in this environment, quickly hardens into assumption. Every unseen reaction was imagined in extremes. Some insisted there must be panic. That no response meant there was no defense. That silence was the sound of people cornered. Others argued the opposite. That the lack of response showed confidence. That addressing a rumor so grotesque would only give it oxygen. Two interpretations. Same silence. But this silence felt different than the palace's. Because this one wasn't institutional. It was personal. And personal silence invites emotional projection. People began filling the gap with imagined scenes. Late-night conversations. Phones buzzing nonstop. Children being ushered away from screens. Advisors urging restraint. Anger flaring. Tears falling. None of it confirmed. All of it believable. And belief, again, did the work of evidence. There's something uniquely unsettling about watching public figures go quiet when they're known for speaking, especially when silence contrasts with a history of addressing controversies head-on. That contrast became a talking point. Why speak so openly about past grievances, but not this? That question echoed everywhere. Some framed it as hypocrisy, others as restraint. A few suggested the stakes were simply too high this time, and that suggestion stuck. Because this story wasn't about reputation alone. It was about identity. And identity, once questioned, isn't easily defended. Here's where the emotional weight of this moment really set in. No matter what anyone believed about the rumor, most people could agree on one thing. This wasn't just another headline. It cut deeper. It targeted the foundation of family itself. And that made the silence from Montecito feel fragile rather than calculated. People began interpreting it as speechlessness. Shock. The inability to respond because there was nothing appropriate to say. Think about that. How do you respond publicly to a claim that questions your children's existence? Not their behavior, not your choices, their identity. There is no template for that. And yet, the internet demanded one. This demand created a cruel paradox. If they responded emotionally, they'd be accused of deflecting. If they responded legally, they'd be accused of hiding. If they stayed silent, they'd be accused of conceding. Every option carried risk, and risk multiplies when children are involved. So the silence held. But holding silence doesn't stop noise. It redirects it. Paparazzi interest spiked, not necessarily because photos were expected, but because absence invites pursuit. Commentators analyzed past footage. Old interviews were replayed. Facial expressions were reinterpreted. Moments meant to show vulnerability were now dissected for subtext. Did they know this was coming? Were there signs in hindsight? Hindsight is dangerous because it rewrites reality. It makes coincidence feel intentional. Every smile becomes forced. Every pause becomes telling. And the audience, hungry for clues, finds them everywhere. This is where the siege feeling intensified. Not a physical siege, though security concerns were certainly discussed, but a psychological one. Because the narrative no longer belonged to the people living inside it. It belonged to everyone else. And everyone else had opinions. Some were vicious, others sympathetic, many contradictory, yet all contributed to the same effect. Pressure. Pressure to speak. Pressure to clarify. Pressure to deny. Pressure to explain. But explaining doesn't always resolve. Sometimes it escalates. There's another uncomfortable truth here. The people demanding answers weren't unified in what they wanted to hear. Some wanted confirmation. Some wanted denial. Some wanted chaos. No statement could satisfy all of them. So any response risked deepening division. And division fuels content, which means the incentive structure was perverse. Silence frustrated audiences. Speech fed algorithms. Neither protected the children. That's the tragedy at the heart of this chapter. Because while adults debated strategy, children remained voiceless. And voicelessness makes them vulnerable to narratives they didn't choose. This vulnerability became a talking point too. Some accused the parents of hiding behind privacy while benefiting from public sympathy. Others defended the right to shield minors from harm at any cost. These debates were rarely gentle. And gentleness was exactly what the situation demanded. Instead, it got spectacle. The siege wasn't just external. It was internal for viewers as well. People who had supported the couple felt conflicted. Defending silence felt right emotionally, but difficult rhetorically. Critics felt vindicated, but uneasy about targeting children. That discomfort didn't stop engagement. It fueled it. Because discomfort creates tension, and tension keeps people watching. This is where the story entered its most volatile phase. Because up until now, silence had been the common thread. Palace silence. Montecito silence. Two very different silences, interpreted in opposite ways. But what united them was this. Neither side was speaking. And when no one speaks, others speak louder. Which brings us to the next evolution. As official voices remained quiet, unofficial ones rushed to fill the gap. Friends, acquaintances, people claiming insider proximity. Suddenly, the internet was flooded with voices claiming to know what was really happening behind the scenes. Some said legal teams were preparing action. Others claimed negotiations were underway to shut down the story quietly. A few insisted the silence was temporary, that a bombshell response was coming. Each claim raised expectations. And expectations, once raised, demand payoff. But no payoff came, which led to frustration. And frustration, online, turns into hostility. People stopped asking politely. They demanded. They framed silence as disrespect, as manipulation, as strategy, as cowardice. The emotional temperature rose. And that's when a subtle shift occurred. The narrative stopped focusing on whether the rumor was true. It started focusing on reaction, or lack of it, which is dangerous. Because when reaction becomes the story, facts become secondary. At that point, even disproving the claim wouldn't undo the perception of evasion. The damage had moved beyond truth. It lived in feeling, and feelings don't retract easily. This is the moment where crisis communication theory collides with human reality. Experts will tell you that ignoring baseless claims can starve them. They don't tell you what happens when those claims involve children and identity. Because those claims don't starve, they metastasize. And as the siege continued, a new factor entered the equation. The internet didn't just speculate about silence anymore. It began interpreting it as timing. People started asking not, why aren't they speaking, but when will they? And that question carried an assumption, that a response was inevitable, that silence was temporary, that something big was coming. This expectation became its own rumor. A response would drop at any moment. A statement, a lawsuit, a carefully crafted message. People refreshed feeds constantly. Nothing. The longer nothing happened, the more dramatic the imagined response became. Which is dangerous, because when reality fails to meet imagined drama, disappointment follows. And disappointment turns into backlash. At this stage, silence no longer bought time. It accumulated risk. And risk tends to force decisions. Which brings us to the next turning point. Because while the public waited for voices from Montecito, something else was happening quietly. The conversation was moving again. Not toward statements. Not toward denial. But toward something that felt more convincing than words. Technology. Specifically, the illusion of proof created by it. Because if no one would speak, people would try to see. And what they thought they saw would soon dominate everything. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most convincing evidence isn't real, but looks real enough to feel undeniable? Because when silence held, and official voices stayed absent, the internet did what it always does in a vacuum. It filled the space, not with restraint, not with patience, but with tools. This is the moment when the story stopped being driven by rumor alone and started being fueled by technology. And that shift changed everything. People didn't just speculate anymore. They analyzed. Or at least, they believed they did. Suddenly, timelines were overlaid. Photos were enlarged. Faces were compared. Shadows were measured. Voices were slowed down. Screenshots were annotated with arrows, circles, and captions that implied discovery. And at the center of it all was a dangerous idea. That technology could see what institutions wouldn't say. The rise of so-called internet detectives wasn't new. But this time, their reach was unprecedented. Because the tools they claimed to use carried an aura of objectivity. AI, algorithms, facial analysis. Those words carry weight. They sound scientific, neutral, precise. They promise certainty in a world full of doubt. And that promise was irresistible. Videos began circulating claiming to use artificial intelligence to compare images across years. Creators spoke confidently about facial mapping, bone structure, and pattern recognition. They showed side-by-side images, drawing lines between eyes, noses, and smiles. To an untrained viewer, it looked compelling. Clean visuals, technical language, confident narration. It felt like proof. But here's the part most people didn't question. AI doesn't work the way these videos suggested. Algorithms don't determine identity with certainty based on childhood photos taken at different angles, lighting conditions, and ages. Facial features change dramatically as children grow. Context matters. Data quality matters. Training models matter. None of that nuance survived the edit. Because nuance doesn't trend. Certainty does. Creators frame their findings as neutral. We're not saying anything. They'd insist, while clearly implying everything. We're just showing what the data reveals. But data doesn't reveal without interpretation. And interpretation is shaped by bias. The algorithms weren't.